website. Our first speaker is Dr. Edson Severnini. Earlier this year, he and his colleagues published a paper called The Hidden Toll of Airborne Lead: Infant Mortality Impacts of Industrial Lead Pollution, which we will learn more about this morning. Just to give you a little bit of background and bio on Dr. Severnini, he's an associate professor of economics and core faculty of the Schiller Institute for Integrative Science and Society at Boston College, a non-resident senior research fellow at the United Nations University World Institute for Development Economics Research, a research fellow at the Institute of Labor Economics, and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. His work focuses on examining the impacts of the expansion of energy access, pollution, and environmental regulation on local development, health outcomes, and firm behavior since the age of electrification. He is also interested in the impacts of climate change on air pollution, electricity generation and infectious disease, the effects of economic activity on environmental outcomes, and on racial issues in local labor markets and in higher education. Professor Severnini's research has been supported by the U.S. National Science Foundation and the Sloan Foundation, and his work has been published at American Economic Review, Review of Economics and Statistics, Economic Journal, AEA Papers and Proceedings, among other journals. Before Boston College, Edson Severini taught at Carnegie Mellon University for more than 11 years, right in our own backyard. He received his PhD in economics from the University of California, Berkeley, and his master's in science and economics from the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. Dr. Severnini, welcome. It is so fantastic to have you here. There you are.
Yeah, good morning.
Good morning to you. And before you begin, I should just note that I wanted to thank sponsors for this event too. With the support of the Heinz Endowments and the Great Lakes Lead Elimination Network, we are able to bring you and all of this amazing agenda and panelists today to the conversation. So I wanted to thank them for supporting this incredible work. So nice to have you with us here. You are virtual from Boston, right?
Yes.
This morning. Great, great. And we are really excited to hear and learn more about the paper. When it first came out, we shared it all across our networks within the Lead Safe Allegheny network. But then, we recognized that there was an opportunity to really continue to getting this information out to so many people across the US. And so this was a perfect forum to be able to doing that. So with that said, I will go off camera and turn the mic over to you. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks so much for having me, Michelle, and thanks to Monica for organizing all the logistical details. I am I feel privileged to be here because I have done a lot of research on the impacts of lead exposure over the years with my co-authors, wonderful collaborators, and I'm so delighted to be talking to you about this work, some of this work. So you mentioned our paper this year. I will start with a little broad overview of other research that we have done, and then I will focus towards that paper towards the end. And I'm sorry for my voice. I'm battling a bad cold, so I hope it's okay as we move forward. So the title of my talk today is The Impact of Lead Exposure on Public Health. And I will start with a motivation. I don't know if I can move these slides or, oh, yeah. So lead continued to impact millions in the US and globally. I always ground myself with this UNICEF report that 1 in 3 children worldwide have blood lead levels above 5 micrograms per deciliter. And as you can see in the figure on the right, lead exposure can happen in so many ways, through the water, through the dust, through the soil, toys, food, lead in the air, industrial emissions, auto emissions, through lead in food, in pets, lead paint in the walls that are cracking. So there's so many ways that kids and people overall can be exposed. I focus on kids here because, as we know, we have different effects for kids versus adults Moving to the next slide. So I like to start by showing how emissions of lead have changed over time in the US. So if you can see this in this bar graph, in the 1970s, you had the majority of the emissions coming from on-road vehicles, pretty much leaded gasoline. And as policies and technologies are changing over time, you see that there is a steep decline in the emissions from on-road vehicles, and you can see that even though metals industrial processing was also important, fuel combustion, on-road engines are important, this becomes more important towards the 1990s. In the next slide, we can see now that in the early 1990s, towards the end of the decade, you have almost zeroing out on the on-road vehicle emissions, and then other sources become more important. For example, the metals, are important, are becoming more as a share of the emissions in the 90s. And then in the 2000s, you see that the non-road engines, pretty much jet fuel, leaded jet fuel from small aircrafts become very important sources. Of course, there is still a lot of lead being emitted from this industrial processing, and I will be focusing on that towards the second part of my talk. In the next slide, I show just the shares, just for you to have a sense of what the importance of each of these sources were throughout the year. So as you can see, until the mid 80s, the on-road emissions, the on-road vehicle emissions, pretty much leaded in gasoline, was responsible for about 80% of the lead emissions in the country, and that dropped precipitously towards the end of the decade, the 1980s, and then of course in the 1990s. We have the ban of lead in gasoline, but by the late 1980s, you are almost close to zero on the emissions from the vehicles, on-road vehicles. And then you can see in the 90s, the metals industrial processing becomes quite important. Almost half of the emissions were coming from that, and that reduced in terms of the share. And then in the 2000s, you see that the non-road engines became an important source, like about 60% in the early 2010s. So you can see that the sources are varying, and that's why it's important to understand what these changes are implying in terms of the effect in public health. Moving to the next slide, I want to just show what this translates into blood lead levels. And here I'm showing the share of people, infants or women in reproductive ages from 15 to 45 that have blood lead levels above 5 micrograms per deciliter. So you can see the first of this is in the 1970s. Pretty much everybody had blood lead levels. All the ones that were tested for enhance had blood lead levels above 5 micrograms per deciliter. Just to give a sense for a reference, in pre-industrial societies, it is estimated that the levels of the blood lead levels were about 0.016. So much, much less than this, but it's important to keep that in mind. As you see, over time, this reduced quite a bit, particularly for women, and then for kids, is still a very important share, have this blood lead levels above 5 micrograms per deciliter. As you move towards at the end of, more recently, when there's this drops in blood lead levels, in the next slide, we see that the share with blood lead levels above 2 micrograms per deciliter, and I chose 2 here, we chose 2 just to, this corresponds to about 125 times larger than the pre-industrial blood lead levels, just to have a sense of where we still are. And as you can see, there was a very steep reduction in women, but for kids, the reduction has been a little is lower, but we got to a point that we have about 17% still with these blood lead levels above 2 microgram per deciliter. Just for reference, the CDC considers one threshold of 3.5 micrograms per deciliter. So we are putting slightly lower because it's still way higher than what is estimated to be the pre-industrial blood lead levels. Moving to the next slide, I want to just give a broad overview of how we would like to potentially estimate the effects of, lead exposure on public health. Ideally, we would, as many of the medical profession does, like would randomize, people and locations into one treatment or another. Of course, this is highly unethical and this is not going to happen, but just to set the stage of what would the ideal experiment be, would have some people exposed, some people not exposed randomly, and then we would see what is the effect of the intervention. So in this diagram, let's say that we, put for the treatment group the love pill, and for the control group like a placebo pill, and then we see how loving people become. I'm sorry, at the end. So we compare the average of love for the people who took the loving pill versus the average love for the people who received the placebo. I'm sorry. And as I said, this would happen in the ideal world. In the next slide, I translate this into what would happen if we wanted to do something similar. Let's assume that policymakers would randomly assign some policies, let's say cleaning the pipes or the water, or making sure that homes are lead remediated in some ways, let's say randomly. Of course, as I said, this highly unethical and impractical. So this is just to set the stage what one would do to estimate the effects of lead exposure on public health. What happens in the next slide is that we have a variable, let's call this treatment variable, which is some measure of lead exposure, and then a variable y, which is the outcome that we would like to examine, let's say a birth weight or incidence of low birth weight or infant mortality or fertility or whatever outcome you have in mind. It turns out that we have a lot of data on both of these variables, the treatment and the outcomes, but both of these variables could be affected by, let's say, third variables, let's call that unobserved confounders. And because of that, we are not able to interpret the correlation or the relationship between this treatment and outcome variable in a causal way that we would potentially like to recommend different policies, for example, for policymakers. And then in the next slide, enter the Nobel Prize winning award for these three economists that really devoted their lives for what we now call research design, trying to untangling cause and effect in human affairs, basically leveraging all this data that has been collected for a variety of other reasons, which are not experimental, it's not randomized controlled trials, but it's still developing methodologies that would allow us to recover quasi-experimental estimates. So it is a natural experiment that is happening throughout society, and that would allow us to understand what is the effect, let's say, lead pollution on infant health or in fertility, for example. Just as a digression, the person on the left, David Card, was actually my PhD advisor at UC Berkeley. So I am really well trained in this tradition of understanding cause and effect in human affairs. So in the next slide, I just want to show how this works. So as I showed you before, there's the treatment variable, let's say lead exposure, and the outcome variable, let's say some measures of infant health. What these researchers proposed was that we leverage natural experiments, so let's say quasi-experiment, which could be a policy change, a historical event, a natural phenomenon that triggers the treatment in a way that was quasi-experimental. It's almost random or as good as random. And that separates from these unobserved confounders and allow us to estimate what is the effect of the treatment, in this case, being exposed to lead in certain ways and how that affects the outcome. And so using this methodology in the next slide, I want to just summarize what Karen Clay, my co-author at Carnegie Mellon, and Alex Hollingsworth, my other co-author at Ohio State University, we have written this paper summarizing the evidence from these quasi-experimental studies on how lead exposure affects fertility, infant mortality, and infant birth outcomes. I will come back to two of these studies, one about fertility, and of course, the study that Michelle referred to in the beginning, the hidden toll of industrial lead emissions. So just to summarize what we found these studies. One of these studies is one that Karen and Margarita and I wrote and published in 2021 in the Journal of Environmental and Resource Economists. And the studies that we nailed down here, so the one in Flint, for example, the lead in water reduced fertility by about 12%. This is, of course, looking at all births in Michigan in over this period, 2008 to 2015. In our study, we are looking at lead in the air. So it's from 78 to 88 when there was a big reduction in on-road vehicle emissions, and that translated to an increase in 6% of fertility. So of course here I'm just putting the results as if there's an increase, but historically there was a decrease. And if we look at lead accumulated in the soil, that would translate in a reduction of about 11%, given the amounts of lead that has been deposited in the soil. So you can see that, like, of course, these are varying across time periods, across locations, but just to give you a broad overview of how we have estimated that lead has affected fertility. In the next slide, I focus on infant mortality. Of course, the previous studies, one of them is by Karen Clay and her co-authors. They show historically in the early 20th century that lead in water basically determined by the types of pipes that cities had increased infant mortality by about 19%. And then Warner Truscott, who was a professor at University of Pittsburgh as well, had this study that looks lead in the water in the 1900s in Massachusetts and find a much larger increase. Of course, these are way higher exposures to lead in the early 20th century. And so what we were trying to do with our study that I will focus later on is on how lead in the air driven by industrial lead emissions would affect infant mortality. And what we see is that the reduction that, has happened in industrial lead emissions would reduce infant mortality by about 3%. I will put these numbers in context as I talk more about this study later on. But just to give a broader sense of other health outcomes, in the next slide, I will just summarize what has happened in terms of the evidence for how lead affects birth weight. And we have, studies showing how important of a marker for later outcomes in life birth weight can be. And so it is important to show that in these quasi-experimental studies, whether the exposure was in the water or in the air, we have a steep decline in birth weight, and again across different time periods, but all in the 2000s across different locations, Michigan or Mexico or in Newark or Charlotte. And then in the next slide, I focus on the incidence of low birth weight, which is basically babies that were born with less than 2,500 grams. And again, we see an increase in the incidence of low birth weight across these studies. And so it's important to keep that in mind because it's another way of computing. And in this paper, we show some simulations of how one could use these estimates to translate, to monetize, and help policymakers using them in cost-benefit analysis. So the idea here is that birth weight is an important marker for later outcomes in life, and some other studies have shown that it affects, for example, earnings. So we can translate this into dollars and help in the cost-benefit analysis of strategies or policies to reduce lead in a variety of types of exposure. So I want to just now focus on one of these studies in the next slide. which is the study that I mentioned on lead infertility. As I mentioned, this was a study that I did with Karen Clay and Margarita Portnick. Both are at Carnegie Mellon, so I did this study while I was at Carnegie Mellon as well, and Karen is my long-term collaborator. So this was looking at lead in gasoline and fertility. So just to motivate this, I want to go back now to the methodology. In the next slide, I just show what is the type of methodology we use here. So it's a quasi-experimental methodology. We call that instrumental variables. And the idea here is that we take a variable z that will be affecting the treatment, but it does not affect the outcome. That's why there's this forbidden sign in the bottom of the chart, which says variable z doesn't affect the outcome variable y directly. It's only through the treatment. So it determines the treatment, but it's not related to the unobserved confounders. And so in the next slide, I show what is the idea that we use. So historically in the US, we had the construction, the planning of the interstate highway system in the 1940s. And this is the map, which was the plan. So the idea here was that the policymakers were trying to connect cities and making sure that resources could potentially be moved relatively easily throughout the country in case of invasion. So it was created primarily for military purposes, given that the US is this continental, gigantic territory, how to make sure that resources could be easily moved around the country in case of an invasion. And so, of course, there was also the concern of connecting big cities. Most of these resources were in cities or close to cities. And so of course, as the interstate highway system was being built from the 1950s and forward, some of these were actually built exactly like planned, but some of them were not built exactly as planned for, political reasons. And so what we are using here is the intention to build these highways in particular locations. And given that lead has been used, for vehicle fuel, for gasoline, so leaded gasoline, having this interstate highway close to you or cutting through your county, you would potentially have a higher intended exposure to lead coming from these vehicles. Of course, counties with or without these highways are different, so we don't take that only into consideration, but we're going to be leveraging this intention to be exposed with the policy changes that happens in the late 70s and in the early 90s. So in the next slide, I show what happens with lead in the air for counties that were supposed to be cut through by the interstate highway system in the solid line. As you can see here, the levels were quite high. It was close. It got even above, on average, above 1 microgram per cubic meter. Just for references, nowadays we think of like the EPA threshold for lead in the air is 0.15 micrograms per cubic meter. So this is like 10 times higher than the standards that we have today. And so notice that the levels of airborne lead in those counties that were supposed to be cut through by the interstate highway system were above what was the airborne lead in counties that were not supposed to be cut through by the interstate highway system, as you can see in the dashed line. And in 1979, there is a policy change that basically mandated that we would have only up to zero point 0.8, you know, grams of lead per gallon of gasoline. And then there's another policy change in 1985, which makes it even stricter, that we would have up to 0.5 grams per leaded gallons of gasoline, which is more strict. And so as you can see, the distance between the two lines that were quite large in the beginning, they start shrinking from the first policy change, and gets really close after the second policy change. So you have these policy changes in locations that were supposed or not to receive the interstate highway system, and that was triggering exposure to lead differentially over time. And so what happens then with fertility in these locations? As we go in the next slide, we see that the fertility in places that were supposed to receive the interstate highway system in the solid lines, the fertility rates are below what was the fertility in the places with which were not supposed to receive the interstate highway system in the dashed line. But as I was talking in the previous graph, like as lead was reducing more in places that were supposed to receive the interstate highway system, now fertility in those places are actually going up. As you can see, at some point, fertility rates in places that were supposed to receive the interstate highway system now is above fertility in places that were not supposed to receive the interstate highway system. That's how we basically estimate the causal effect of exposure to lead in the air on fertility rates. So in the next graph, in the next slide, we show what the effects were. So if we were to take, the fertility rates in with the airborne lead levels as if they were the same as 1978. So in the top left corner of this figure, you see that in the dashed line, we would have a much lower fertility rate than the observed one in the solid line. So going down on the left, we see that the observed fertility was increased by about 2.5 children per 1,000 women in reproductive ages. In the top right graph, we see what would have been the number of births in the dashed line that would have happened if lead had stayed in the levels of 1978. And in the solid line, what is the number of births that were actually observed? So the number of births in the right bottom graph is about towards the end of the period, almost 100,000 more births per year because of this reduction of lead in the air. So it was a sizable change in fertility that was driven by these policy changes of reducing the amount of lead in gasoline. So this is one of the studies that we did. And now I want to focus on the study that Michelle mentioned earlier on the hidden toll of airborne lead, which is looking at the effects of industrial lead pollution on infant mortality. So this is again a study conducted with Karen Clay from Carling Mellon and Xiao Wang, who was our postdoc at CMU a few years ago, and now she's in China. So the picture in the background here is of a lead smelter just to show how it looks like today around the country. So in the next slide, I just want to motivate why we were focusing on this particular outcome. While the literature on lead and health is large, we know surprisingly little about this relationship between airborne lead and infant mortality. As we summarize the literature using quasi-experimental studies, earlier on, you notice that the other studies looking at infant mortality are historical studies from the early 20th century where levels of exposure was much higher and the access to medical care was much worse. So it's still very important, but it's difficult to use those studies to inform policy today. So we found no studies that show a causal relationship between air lead and infant mortality. There were a number of studies trying to correlate these two variables, but again, with the important confounders that could potentially lead to correlation not leading to causation, we were concerned to two key challenges. One is avoidance behavior. Some people might have the information and react to it, and it could potentially avoid or remediate the exposure. And also there's measurement error, which is related to the fact that in some cases, the sample of blood lead levels is not large enough, and we have to rely on other sources of exposure, which is pretty much lead in the air. And we don't, because people don't carry monitors in their backpacks all the time, we cannot know for sure how much exposure they have had. And in particular, throughout pregnancy, if we're looking at infant mortality within 1 year, so Part of the exposure might have happened in the previous year, so timing of exposure might be an issue here. And these are two factors that could bias the estimates in this correlation between lead exposure and infant mortality. So showing that this link is causal would increase the regulatory benefits of reducing lead pollution, because then we could use the number of avoided deaths and multiply that by the value of a statistical life, which is the way EPA and other federal agencies do the calculation in cost benefit analysis to provide evidence that the standards or policies, regulations should be strengthened. So in the next slide, I want to talk about what this paper really does, which is using this instrumental variables approach that I just explained to understand the effects, the causal effects of air lead concentration on infant mortality in the US. And the period here is 1988 to 2018. The beginning is dictated by the creation of the toxic release inventory that was for the first time collecting information in 1987. The quality of the information in 1987 is not as great, so we start in 1988. And this is basically, manufacturing plants and other plants had to report to EPA their emissions of a variety of toxics, including lead. And by 1988, nearly all of the decline in lead in gasoline had occurred, as I showed you earlier in those graphs. So just in the next slide, if you could move to the next slide. So we draw on a variety of data, as I said, TRI, plant lead level emissions, and other chemicals. We use information from EPA on the monitoring stations that provide measurements of lead in the air and other pollutants. We also got data from CDC on child blood lead levels for a subset of the counties that we use in our analysis, and of course, vital statistics from the US, which contain information on infant mortality and other birth and outcomes and maternal characteristics. And of course, we are going to be using a variety of other variables, whether are socioeconomic or just weather or meteorological conditions from a variety of sources, for example, NOAA and from the American Community Survey and censuses from the US, which are available at the county level. So it's drawing on a variety of pieces of information to run the study, which emphasizes the need for data collection for these studies to be done. So in the next slide, what we are focusing on from this study. So TRI, the tox release inventory, requires that these plants provide emissions in two ways. One is the releases that goes through the confined vents, ducts, and pipes. Basically, they stack emissions. Think about this as coming through the stacks that are visible to people, but also fugitive emissions, so which are all other releases. They are not coming through the regular vents and ducts and pipes, but could happen because of mishandling and misprocessing of operations that escaping through the doors and windows. It could be a result of spills or handling of ash. It could be resuspension from the soil. So it's a variety of other sources. Importantly, these fugitive emissions are more intermittent, they're more unpredictable, and they are not visible to people, let's say, around these plants. They can potentially avoid the emissions that they could potentially expect from the chimneys and other stacks, but not these fugitive emissions. But all plants must calculate, or at least give a sense of what they are for the tox release inventory. So this is going to be a central part of our analysis. So in the next slide, we are going to be focusing on this, the sources of lead emissions, the stack emissions and fugitive lead emissions for these 127 counties with air lead monitoring. So of course, EPA doesn't monitor pollutants in all counties in the US, but importantly for us, these counties represent over a fourth of the US population and about a fifth of all lead emissions in the country. Later in our calculations, we're going to use another sample of another 100 counties, and that would be responsible for about 44% of the US population. And the reason why we don't include that in the analysis is because we don't have all the variables needed for all these counties to be included. So in the next slide, I just want to show what is, if you could go to the next slide, just the, yes, what are these counties? So these 127 counties, which are more the urban counties where most population live, these are spread around the country. And as I said, we're going to be using another 100 counties that have lead emissions comparable to the counties in red, but unfortunately we didn't have all the variables to run the analysis them together, but they are, similar, and so we can extrapolate the effects for those counties as well. And as I said, they would represent about 44% of the U.S. population. In the next slide, I want to just give a sense of what are these types of lead emissions that we are talking about here. So 48% of these emissions are coming from lead manufacturing and 29% from metal manufacturing. So other sources, so this represents over 3/4 of all air lead emissions from industrial facilities. Other important sources could be ceramics and paint, and they would already get to 90% of all the emissions happening around the country. In the next slide, I want to show how these fugitive and stack emissions have dropped over time. So as you can see in this solid line, this is the total of lead emissions that were reported by these polluting facilities to EPA. And as you can see, this is reducing over time, particularly after as the toxic release inventory is put in place, because now the information is available, and then there could be pressure from communities. There is also like top facilities in terms of emissions that could be targeted for regulations or for more stringent regulation, and so on and so forth. Importantly, as you can see, both stack and fugitive emissions are also reducing, but particularly stack, which is more visible to people who live close to these facilities around the country. But it is the case that there is a reduction in air emissions from these facilities, or lead emissions from these facilities. So in the next slide, I want to show how these two types of emissions could impact the probability of having elevated blood levels for kids. So this is basically the probability of having a sample of blood that contains lead above 10 micrograms per deciliter. And as you can see, there is a strong correlation from the fugitive lead emissions, but not the stack emissions, suggesting again that people could potentially react to the information they know, which is what they expect from the stack lead emissions, but fugitive is more unpredictable, it's more intermittent, and you don't know when it's happening, and that's difficult to avoid. And so that's why our central part of the analysis is coming from these fugitive lead emissions, which is something that people might not be easily predicting, and then they cannot avoid. So in the next slide, I want to just go back to the empirical strategy, which is again using this quasi-experimental strategy using instrumental variables. And here we are going to instrument, or basically trigger this treatment, which is exposure to airborne lead, due to this concentration, this interaction between the fugitive lead emissions from the TRI with wind speed. What is the idea here? It is difficult to predict these fugitive emissions, and it's also difficult to know what the wind speed will be. If the wind is, if it's faster, it's going to spread this to a larger area, and it's going to go potentially in also unpredictable ways, and we need to take that into account. But again, fugitive emissions are unintended, intermittent, difficult for people to understand. And wind speed variation is plausibly exogenous. Nobody knows exactly where the wind is, what is the speed that the wind is going to blow. And so, of course, controlling for a variety of other things, including the other chemicals reported by the TRI, that's how we trigger the treatment. And this triggering of the treatment is unrelated to the other potential confounders, allowing us to estimate what is the causal effect of airborne lead concentration on infant mortality. So in the next slide, I just want to show why this potentially works. So here is just to show how the plume varies once it's emitted. So this is from a chimney, but it's even worse when the fugitive emissions are on the ground level. You can see that the ways the wind could blow, it could determine whether there is a looping or coning or fanning. And the looping is about 30% or a third of the facilities in the US has this pattern. So wind blows in certain ways that you could go, the exposure, the lead emissions could go up or down in these ways that is difficult to predict. And so that creates this quasi-experimental levels of exposure to airborne lead for people living in those communities. And so when we estimate the relationship between fugitive emissions and how the wind is blowing, in the next slide is what we find. We find that as the wind blows faster, we find higher levels of airborne lead concentration captured by the EPA monitors. And as the wind goes even higher in speed, this becomes quite important. So at the end here, if the wind is blowing quite fast, we get an exposure of about it gets to almost 0.14 micrograms per cubic meter in lead in the air. So this is a quasi-experimental exposure. People are not seeing, not expecting, and that's how it goes, it becomes closer to this ideal experiment, which is happening naturally because these emissions are not observed by people and they cannot predict and they cannot avoid. So using this source of variation, in the next slide, we basically estimate, the effects, which are the main results of the paper. There are two main findings. The first is that higher airborne lead concentration causes higher infant mortality, both in the first year and in the first month. So in the next slide, I showed these results in a table, which is one of the main tables in the paper. As you can see here, controlling for a variety of other variables that could potentially determine exposure, we see that if airborne lead concentration increased by 1 microgram per cubic meter, which is huge, it would increase infant mortality by 1.6 deaths for each 1,000 live births. And just to have a sense of what the average was in this period was about 7.7. So it would be a very large effect. Of course, the change in airborne lead caused by this reduction in industrial lead emissions was about impacting the airborne lead concentration of about 0.15, and that's why it would increase infant mortality, in this case, decrease infant mortality because it was a reduction in lead by about 3%. That's what I said earlier when I was summarizing the results of these and other studies. In the next slide, I show what happens when we just narrow it down for the first month of life. So there is an important effect that happens in the first month of life, not only in the first year. Why is it important? Because it suggests that some of this exposure might have happened in utero. So the fetus was affected by the exposures that their mothers had during pregnancy. And for that reason, both channels should be important. It's during pregnancy and also after the first, once the baby is born, exposed to airborne lead after birth. Now, in the next slide, I show you what happens when we mismeasure this exposure. So if I were to estimate what is the effect of airborne lead on infant mortality using the actual measure of infant mortality, which is under 1 year, and if we don't take exposure and measure exposure well, meaning if all the exposure is not from the same year that we are observing the deaths of these infants, we could underestimate the effect. So for example, in column 2 that I'm highlighting in red, the effect is 1.6. If I go for column 4, which is just exposure from April to December, meaning at least the last trimester of pregnancy was, the exposure happened in the year that the infant died, the effect is even larger. And if I go on column 6, highlighted in green, if I were to take at least 2 trimesters of the pregnancy in the same year that we observed the death of the infant, that would be a 2.6, so a much larger effect. So it's super important to measure the exposure and the timing of the exposure well. Otherwise, we would be underestimating the harmful effects of exposure to lead. So that's what I said earlier, that we have to account not only for the confounding factors, but also for the timing of exposure. So moving on to the next slide, and I'm cognizant of time. So Michelle and Monica told me that I have 45 minutes, so I will end within those 45 minutes. So just to summarize the evidence we had in this paper, how does this evidence translates into avoided deaths? So if we were to look at the all lead emissions from industrial facilities in those 227 counties where lead exposure is quite similar, or lead emissions were quite similar, the effects we are estimating is translating into about 307 avoided deaths per year. If we use the value of a statistical life that EPA uses, which is about $11 million in dollars of 2023, this translates of an annual benefit of about $3.5 billion. So in cost benefit analysis, using this particular outcome per se, which has not been taken into account as of now, it would make the benefits much larger, suggesting that more costly regulations could still pass a cost benefit analysis. So just to give you an overview of how this evidence would translate into for policymakers. Moving to the next slide, I just want to mention the second main finding, which is that high air lead concentration increased deaths for particular causes of death. And we highlighted three: uh, dying because of low birth weight or sudden unexplained infant death, SUDS, and respiratory nervous systems cause. So in the next slide, I showed this in the table, and we estimate, if you could move to the next slide, so we estimate this in the first year of life, showing that there are important effects of causes of deaths by these particular causes. And in the following slide, I highlight the same in the first month of life, again suggesting that both exposure in utero and after birth are important. Moving to the next slide, I just want to explore quickly what this means. So the sudden unexpected infant death, of course, there's a lot of speculation that exposure to lead would affect, for example, the seeds. And so we are basically showing in a causal way that this is in fact happening. And of course, there's some biological pathways that this could potentially happen. One is neuroinflammation. It has shown to affect, for example, rats in laboratory, also affects sleep in laboratory, which could also affect SUD because it affects seeds as well. And so other evidence from animal studies show that lead weakens the immune system, and not surprisingly, this is related to respiratory deaths as well. So moving to the next slide, I just want to summarize the contributions of this study. One was that we are focusing here, providing the first causal estimates of airborne lead on infant mortality in a modern setting with contemporary medical care and levels of exposure that are much lower than the previous studies that have been looking at infant mortality from water in early 20th century, or different from other studies, quasi-experimental studies that were focusing on other birth outcomes, like, for example, birth weight. The second main contribution in the next slide is on the mechanism. So at least in economics, this is very underexplored. Of course, medical and animal studies have suggested that these mechanisms could potentially be in play. And here we are providing the first causal estimates linking lead exposure to a specific cause of death. And I think importantly showing that this is causal, it's not just a correlation in the data. So to provide some concluding remarks in the next slides, I just want to say that these are new estimates that could potentially inform investments to reduce air lead emissions, particularly from industrial and other sources in the US. In this country, industrial firms and aviation are still emitting thousands of pounds of lead in the air. And again, putting more broadly around the world, we still have a lot of children and people exposed to blood lead levels. So just a couple of minutes in the next two slides on what this could potentially translate for policymakers. So in our review paper, Karen, Alex, and I write that two things that policymakers could do. One is strengthening surveillance and screening. And the goal here would be to detect and prevent lead exposure, both in pregnancy and early childhood. And some actions could be just, examining blood lead levels for pregnant women and infants, improving testing, and maybe collecting children's teeth just to check what the cumulative exposure has been. But importantly, to lower the thresholds for concern. Nowadays, in several jurisdictions, the levels of concern is 10. In other places is 5. So we could at least align this with CDC of 3.5 and begin testing before age 1. The second implication in the next slide would be for identify the sources and improve interventions. And here could be just mapping exposure more broadly using, for example, lead isotope, property level testing. If you go to the next slide, just quickly, I want to show that how it happens in Massachusetts. For example, there is this data set where if a housing unit has been found to have hazardous level of lead, they have to remediate and then they have to pass a reinspection. So this is publicly available data that unfortunately is not being used quite a bit for people. So this information is out there, but it's not used. So going back to the slide, so we could also fund RCT to understand how remediation or nutritional interventions could potentially help and integrate this new evidence in cost-benefit analysis. So in 2016, EPA, we studied the potential revisions of the lead standards and kept the previous one. So I think we have now more evidence to strengthen that. And of course, using the existing dose response function for lead in the air, which has been used for particulate matter, for example. So this would avoid costly delay. So going forward in two slides, I just want to finish by saying if we were to use this evidence, this is the type of signs we should put around our communities in places where there might be exposure to lead. So if you are at workplace or in your communities, especially in places with old housing, for example, or old lead pipes, we should be aware of how it is affecting our children and ourselves. So thank you so much. And I hope I finished within the 45 minutes. Thanks so much, Michelle.
You did, Edson. Congratulations.
Yeah.
Thank you. This was truly a scientific lesson for all of us and quite amazing because we often don't hear about the correlation between lead exposure and air. And this was, I think, for many people, probably giving us a whole lot of new information that wasn't as familiar to them. I appreciated that retrospective of you starting back and giving us that, setting the groundwork for giving us those summaries of early studies and the calculations and graphs. Because oftentimes, like when we do public education sessions, we'll talk about lead exposure as it relates to low birth weights and premature births and infant mortality. But you had the data behind it that was really fascinating for us to see and really have us think about how we share that information in various educational settings. Thank you so much for that. I wanted to ask you a question in terms of what you all have seen from a policy perspective. Are the policy or the regulatory bodies such as the EPA, is there stringent enough emissions controls right now as it relates to lead, or is that a policy area which should be explored much more deeply given your information findings?
Yeah, I think as of now, we potentially have evidence that could lead to stronger or more strict regulations.
Mm-hmm.
I think, as I mentioned, like in 2016, there was an effort to revise the standard for at least airborne lead levels, and
Mm-hmm.
EPA retained the previous the previous standard, which was from 2008, which is
Mhm.
exposure up to zero point 0.15 micrograms per
Mhm.
cubic meter. This is airborne lead, right? Like, so,
Mhm.
of
Mhm.
course, emissions from facilities around the country are just one source. It could be resuspension of lead in soil and so on and so forth. Now, by law, EPA has to revise these standards about every 5 years. And
Mhm.
so at the time, the reports mentioned that there was not enough evidence to revise these standards. And so we are studying this issue because we think it is the case that we have stronger evidence. And so not only us, but a variety of other people have been studying these issues to provide evidence that exposure to lower levels to what EPA is showing or the standard is right now could potentially have effects. And that's, I think, one of the more powerful evidence to strengthen the current regulatory framework. The toxic release inventory doesn't have a bite other than providing information. So I think you can go on the website and see what is the emissions of lead in the communities where you are. It's
Mhm.
easily accessible. But what people do in general is to look at the top emitters in their communities and make pressure on them, right? So that's how the information has been used in a variety of settings. So even though it's just like information, that information can be a powerful tool to make pressure. So I think there's no bite of the regulation, it's just providing the information.
Mhm. So for the advocates in the room, take notice and think about ways to build coalitions around this incredible information. There's a question in the chat, Edson,
Hmm.
that I'd like to share with you. So,
Hmm.
should public health? Oh, it moved because somebody. Let me scroll back up to the top. It was here. We are. Should public health officials issue during air quality days to the public, particularly pregnant women, when it is windy, even if there isn't smoke or smog in the air? So, in terms of how, what is the role of local government in terms of in sharing this information on, for instance, poor air quality days, thinking about your plume? I mean, no, I suspect nobody thought we were going to get a meteorological lesson here today, which was fascinating to me. So the question says, particularly in places like the city county next door to UC Berkeley, where there are the Chevron oil refineries, as an example. Are refineries required to stop operations on these windy days? Are they asked to curtail their emissions during these times so that it doesn't, as the plumes, as the three plumes that we've seen, have an impact? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think like it is important to potentially use those levers. Like I don't, I think only rarely they have been used, right? So I think our research suggests that measurements of emissions are an important tool to think about that. And I think like understanding when there is a particularly windy day that we will spread those emissions downwind from the facilities, it's important to at least inform the public, right? Whether they are going to curtail operations or not, that is like a more difficult task because that's the main trade-offs that we have in environmental regulation. It's how to balance economic activity with the byproduct of this same economic activity. So I think that's a more complicated, but at least inform the public, right? I think nowadays we have some policies in place that requires, at least for bigger cities, to inform the public when we have a higher, pollution day, whether it's from particulate matter or ozone. I haven't seen much from lead because lead is also part of particulate matter. And I think like it's important
Mhm.
to keep that in mind.
Mhm.
So it could be that in those days that the air is very polluted because of high particulate matter, it could be potentially lead
Mhm.
particles. But I
Mhm.
think like being more explicit about this could be informative for people. As I mentioned, like unfortunately, fugitive lead emissions are not super predictable, right? Like they happen intermittently. So it's difficult to know when that potentially is happening. But again, And in abundance of caution, you should at least inform people around those facilities,
Mhm,
especially if they're downwind from those facilities, that there is a chance that
mhm.
that could potentially be happening those days. And so be aware of those and protect themselves.
So you may know from your days at CMU, there's an interesting app that's been created by the Create Lab at CMU, and it's
Mhm.
plumepgh.org. And people can take a look at that and see what's happening in Pittsburgh's backdoor, and then perhaps emulate it in your communities as well. It's a fascinating tool that looks at emissions and looks at the route that plumes are taking, and impact then to communities across Allegheny County. There
Mhm.
was in here a statement that perhaps the current administration is no longer collecting emission data with a question mark. Do you know anything about that? And if not, it's something that we can note here and then respond throughout the day.
Yeah, I'm not so sure about like what is the type of data. I know that there's a effort to curtail collection of data. I'm not sure
Okay.
specifically on the TRI, but
Okay.
it's something that like, we should know. Also, I have to say that there is an effort to eliminate the scientific body that examines the evidence, right? So that's another assail to the process of
Mm-hmm.
revising the standards that could be important. As I mentioned, this is just one piece of evidence. They are evaluated by a scientific committee to back whether they keep or they strengthen the standards. And so without a good body, impartial body of evidence that examines the evidence as they are, I think it's difficult to use this evidence to strengthen the regulation. So
Mm-hmm.
pressure from society has to
Yeah.
be mounted in that direction.
Yeah, absolutely. Another comment that yesterday the EPA reviewed the soil lead remediation standard to 200 parts per million for risk analysis and 600 parts per million for removal, targeting 5 micrograms per deciliter of blood, not 3.5. So just a
Mhm.
note to folks there. And then we'll end on this final question. And for folks who have some additional questions or thoughts, you've been very kind and generous of putting all of your contact information in this slide, so we have it sitting up here, and I do appreciate the image, and it's something that certainly through Lead Safe Allegheny, it really helps us think about campaigns and education to community and how we let folks become more aware of these issues. So we'll end on this question, and then thank you so much for your generous time, for the education that you've provided to all of us today. It's really been certainly a great deal of information that was perhaps new to many, certainly to us, and it gives us more things to think about and consider in terms of our advocacy space. So the last
Thank
question is,
you. Yeah.
yeah, oh gosh, thank you for you and your team for all of your work. The last question is, did you provide data on the BLLs? So this might be a little bit of a recap in relation to the airborne lead and the health outcomes.
Yeah, so earlier in the talk, I showed that fugitive lead emissions were positively associated with the percentage of kids or the probability of kids having blood lead levels above 10 micrograms per cubic per deciliter. We don't have data for all the counties in the analysis, so we had to get just a subset that were made available from the CDC. But we showed that the fugitive lead emissions, not the stack, were actually affecting blood lead levels. And again, suggesting that, people can potentially avoid if they know, but if they don't, then they might suffer the consequence of exposure.
Great summary and a great point to end our discussion this morning. Thank you so much for all of your incredible work that you're doing to help inform communities and have us thinking about some policy changes that we all can work toward. So
And
with that,
and I just want to just say,
yes,
like,
please.
people can feel free to reach out. Like, I
Okay.
think for us who study lead exposure and impacts of public health, it's very important that the communication exists between researchers and people in advocacy and other organizations. So
Keep the
please reach out.
dialogue
Feel
open,
free.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah, indeed,
definitely.
for sure.
Thank you so
For
much.
sure. It is a collaborative effort. We take all of the good science that you all do and then put it into action. And so it's these are the tools that you provide that are needed by all of us here around this table. So thank you for that.